So, I think that, I don't know, is that the right adapter? Okay.
I can go right in here.
I am not proficient in these
And
things.
then so you may want to plug that in. Do you have your power adapter?
Yep. I'll get it.
Have the PowerPoints available to them? So I think there's so much information I'm throwing at them.
Yeah, it's gonna.
But they can, you won't have it access on your website.
No, not right now. We can in the future. If we're recording.
Okay. Yeah.
And we are broadcasting it live.
Okay. So they can.
So they'll see that.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a switcher up or switcher down. You put sort of supposed to be able to see your PowerPoint actually on the screens at home. So rather than having to see it on the big screen through the camera.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah. Great. And will we see the viewers?
What the viewers are
presenters'
seeing?
viewer? No, the here.
You will see.
The presenter's view. You know what I mean?
Yes, like yours.
Yeah.
Right? Whatever you normally see when you're doing a PowerPoint.
Sounds good.
So maybe I need to. I might be doing this wrong. It's so slow. There we go.
You're live. It's all working. Oh, good. So not only that one's working.
Oh, these are the very important sessions. Not the other way.
Well, it's so weird. I figured out my router won't do that. My MacBook will. So it takes the Ethernet out and it'll split it out and become the Wi-Fi router. Well, the router won't do it. The MacBook will. Oh, I'm glad I figured it out.
I'll be up there if you need
Okay.
anything. Just
And I just need to put my phone plugged in just while I'm doing this, but then I'll plug it back in.
just plug it back in. It should pop back up. I'll keep an eye on it.
Thank you.
What does that mean?
Thank you. our next session, we will look at queer religious trauma and post-traumatic growth. And they'll be doing some PowerPoint presentations up here, so the number for texting won't be up here, but hopefully you've got it memorized or it's in your phone. In case you don't, it is 801-613-1478. 801-613-1478 is the number to text your questions to. So I'm just going to read a brief introduction, the prompt that our panelists have been asked to respond to, and then I will turn the time over to the moderator, Lisa Hansen. LGBTQ Mormons experience distress, trauma, and suicidal ideation at disproportionately higher rates than their LDS Church member cohort. This reality has been featured prominently in headlines for several years. Dr. Brian Simmons will present his recent research exploring the relationships between religious orientations, orthodoxy, spiritual trauma, and PTSD in LGBT Mormons and ex-Mormons. Dr. Michael Staley will present a snapshot of his ongoing work in the Utah State Medical Examiner's Office, attempting to understand suicidality rates in Utah, particularly within the LGBTQ community or population. Based on his decades of research and counseling practice focusing on resolving sexual, religious, and social conflicts, Dr. Lee Beckstead will present a roadmap for how queer religious people distressed by their experiences in faith communities can experience post-traumatic growth, and he'll explain what that even means. And then, of course, Lisa Hansen, again, I refer you to your programs for biographical sketches about each of the individuals up here, but Lisa Hansen will be our moderator, and Lisa Hansen is a therapist who most of her, if not all, come from the LGBTQ Mormon community. So I will turn the time over to Lisa.
Oh, thanks for being here. It is not lost on me that you're hearing from 3 white men. I'm the diversity today. Identity development is understood as, if you've ever taken a child development class, starting from trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, and then identity comes before intimacy. Experiences we have enable these positive experiences about ourselves and allow us to integrate our experience into our identity that we then use to understand ourselves and connect with others. However, experiences that we have that violate our identity or our trust or our autonomy, our initiative, and our industry actually keep us from being able to integrate an identity and then be intimate with others. This kind of thing can keep us forever adolescents, trying to get to know who we are, how we feel, and how to make sense of our lives. They keep us from internal peace and from intimacy with others. As a therapist who works primarily with LGBTQ individuals, couples, and families, the ability to trust our own identity is primary. It's perhaps the main mental health issue we see at our clinic. I'm sure you can think of dozens of reasons for this. I believe that every piece of false information we receive about ourselves is likely to create some degree of trauma in our lives, particularly if it's spiritual or religious trauma that comes from an external source that says this is the source of absolute truth in our lives. Is it any wonder that the LGBTQ population experiences more trauma than the average section of our population? If you find that anything in this session triggers your sense of trauma, please feel free to get up and move around and find your own center again. Many of the things that we experience together and we understand. Against the backdrop of what we're doing here, I want to offer 2 quotes to frame. The first is from Jazz Jennings. Being transgender isn't a medical transition. It is a process of learning to love yourself for who you are. And Audre Lorde, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Brian Simmons.
Thank you. And while I hopefully have this pop up, okay. I just want to start by thanking everyone for being here, also thanking the University of Utah and Mormons Building Bridges for both having this conference and bringing us together. So as was mentioned earlier, I will be talking a little bit about PTSD, religious orientation, and spiritual trauma in LGBTQ Mormons and former Mormons. So I want to start off with setting the framework, setting the scene, with the statement that the researcher Gordon Allport once stated, that essentially there's a paradox of religion. The religion can both be a therapeutic community, or in today's sense, a spiritual home, and it can also instill an abnormal degree of terror. And I think this is something that we're all familiar with, or we wouldn't be sitting in this room today. The dual sword that religious teachings and a religious organization can be. When religion installs terror, that is where we get spiritual trauma. And for my research, I looked at trauma both as the intentional and unintentional harm that may come from a religious teaching or experience. And I really want to highlight that the unintentional harm. I think it's very easy at times to say these messages were in good faith, and I don't discredit that one bit. I believe often if a person's religious orientation, whether or not they are intrinsic or extrinsic oriented, would impact their perception of trauma from LDS teachings, and if that trauma or perceived trauma did indeed result in post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm not going to go too deep into this because I know a lot of us have talked about this already, but in the Latter-day Saint tradition, there are several teachings that enshrine the heterosexual myth, as Taylor mentioned yesterday, into our doctrine. One is that in the Doctrine and Covenants it's stated that essentially heterosexual marriage is required for salvation. And recently church leaders have stated that same-sex marriage or cohabitation is a serious transgression and may or may not be subject to excommunication. Other church leaders have also stated that gender I'm a quantitative researcher, and I like numbers, and I will be presenting a lot of numbers. I do want you to remember that each one of these data points has a human story. Earlier today, we were talking about trafficking in stories. My data doesn't get into the face, but again, these are 278 faces who have experienced this intersection of LGBT and else theology. So, something went terribly wrong on my graphics here. The demographics, essentially, half of the study group identify as lesbian or gay, a quarter identifies bisexual, 10% were same-sex attracted, Another 10% were identified as other. Looking at this was mostly asexual. Overall, the population of the survey was white. They did almost half of them lived in Utah, and on average, they were 33 years. So actually, the demographics of my survey did closely mirror the demographics of Utah. It's hard to see the way that this slide has turned out, but 45% were male, 39% were female, and 16% identified as transgender or another gender variant. I did ask some questions about their LDS involvement. And again, I apologize that the graphics went wonky and that these numbers are hard to see. But on the whole, most participants had been born in the church. About 80% had been born into an LDS family. For those who were converted later in life, the average age was 18 years old. Almost 70% of participants had received their LDS endowment, and 1% had a temple recommend at the time of the survey. Missionary service was more common for males, which is not surprising, and 65% said that they were still members in good standing. They were asked if they attended at least monthly, and 52% of the survey population said that they still attend monthly, or at least monthly. And I think that this is very important to point out at this point. Both that the 52% are still attending church at the time of the survey, and that 31% had a temple recommend. This would represent that this sample is comprised of a fair number of active, participating Mormons, and not just an embittered ex-Mormon. I then presented these statements to the participants and asked them to rate from extremely beneficial to extremely damaging, how they felt about these experiences. Again, it was very important for them to present this, that they could also identify that these statements or these beliefs helped them and that they found them beneficial. This essentially was the result. The dark red is extremely damaging, the pink is damaging, and there is no gray or blue variants. And these are colored with the average response of the participants. So as you can see, of the 21 statements, not a single statement that a majority of the participants said was beneficial to any degree. And overall, most of them said that these statements were damaging. And I don't want to dwell too much on the individual statements. Some of them are more broad, like homosexuality is a sin. Others, that God would punish you for your sexual orientation or gender identity. Further, that maybe your gender identity or sexual orientation will be changed after death. Again, I'm not going to dispute or try to claim what the intent of the messages were. I'm going to accept that most church leaders do act with positive intent, but the result is that the participants overwhelmingly felt these were damaging statements. Again, 95% of the participants identified at least one of these experiences as damaging. So there were only 5% of the survey that went through the survey that said everything that I experienced in the church regarding to sexual and gender identity was a positive experience. On average, they identified 14 statements as being damaging or extremely damaging, and you can see the largest portion, about 50%, were that 15 to 20 events. So a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a clinical diagnosis of a set of symptoms that cause clinical impairment in the person. Post-traumatic stress disorder grew out of work with veterans and survivors of other kind of violent acts like rape or sexual abuse. Essentially, PTSD has a set of symptoms: intrusion, having thoughts that you can't get out of your mind, having flashbacks or disturbing reminders; avoidance, you avoid people, places, things that might remind you of the experience; and then arousal, jumpy, startled. Again, if you look at PTSD and that, something like a car backfiring will trigger them to think that they're being shot. One thing I do want to note is that particularly in my case, I asked them to respond to these symptoms based on their religious experiences. So it wasn't general PTSD, but it was very specific religious-based PTSD. So how often did you have distressing flashbacks about a religious or spiritual experiences? How often did you avoid people, places, things that reminded you of your spiritual experiences? On average, people had more, and again, I apologize, this is not how the slide looked when I created it. Avoidance symptoms were more prevalent than arousal or intrusion symptoms. So again, people feeling agitated when in the presence of something that would remind them of their spiritual or religious experiences. And when looking at the criteria guidelines to diagnose with PTSD, 73% of participants who responded to the survey would have likely met criteria for PTSD during their lifetime. In looking at the general population, we expect about 8% of people in the general population to experience PTSD. So the black line there at 10% is basically a representation of the general public. And then you see on the top